Hello, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us this morning for this hopefully interesting conversation titled Another Term for Museveni. My name is Monica Kiria. I work here at the Christian Nicholson Institute at the UFO Anti-Corruption Resource Center, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this discussion. So Yoweri Museveni has governed Uganda since 1986, which I assume you all know since you're here out of your interest, making him one of the longest-serving leaders in Africa. He came to power after a protracted civil war, presenting himself as a reformer committed to restoring stability after years of political violence and economic collapse. In his early years, his government gained strong domestic and international support for rebuilding state institutions and implementing economic reforms that stabilize the economy. And for a long time, Uganda was seen as a relative success story in a turbulent region. Over time, however, Museveni's rule has become increasingly personalized and authoritarian. Constitutional term limits and age limits were removed to allow him to remain in office, and political competition has been progressively constrained. Elections, however, continue to be held regularly, but they take place in an environment marked by restrictions on opposition activity, media, and civic space. And many analysts now understand Uganda's political system less in terms of democratic alternation and more in terms of regime durability and control. So, at this moment, Uganda is heading into an election in quite an unsettled moment, because underneath the apparent continuity, important things are shifting. Museveni's advanced age is becoming increasingly obvious, and who will succeed him is probably one of the most important political questions hanging over Uganda. Along with this are questions about how his regime exercises and maintains power, and how citizens, especially younger ones, engage with elections, politics, and the state under these conditions. So today we want to discuss what's really going on in Uganda, what's really going on underneath the surface, and we are very pleased to be joined by three experts on Ugandan politics. First, online in a recording, because the internet has been shut down in Uganda, we have Adrian Juko, a human rights lawyer and lecturer at Makerere University with extensive experience in strategic litigation and civic space as advocacy. We'll show the recording later in the conversation. And we are happy to have with us here in person Matthew Gichohi. Welcome, Matthew.
Morning, Monica.
Matthew's work here at CMI focuses on democratization and identity politics in sub-Saharan Africa, including Uganda. And we are also very pleased to have Andrea Kronstad-Felde, a researcher at the University of Bergen, studying student politics and participation in authoritarian settings across Africa. Welcome, Andrea. So our first question is going to go to you, Matthew. Given all that we know about Uganda and, the elections and the fact that the result is more or less a foregone conclusion, how should we understand the role of elections in Uganda today? Are they still sites of political competition, or are they just rituals that serve a political purpose? And what purpose could this be, especially with Museveni's succession looming over the country?
Okay, big questions. Morning, everyone.
What about the loudspeakers? Are you not going to use them?
They are right. Is my voice just too soft? I could move. Is that better?
Yeah, that's
Okay. Sorry, vocal cord issues. Can't explain it. Sorry, so yeah, really big question. So the role of elections, I think there is something, even though the elections are happening under the guise of heavy securitization, and now I'm hearing some static. So under the guise of securitization and repression, I think there is something important to say about going to the polls every 5 years and having some sort of, that's maybe what it was, something to go to the polls every 5 years and casting your vote. There's a practice that is involved, there's an ideology about what democratization should entail, but at the same time, without democracy actually having the substantive aspects of it, just the procedural aspects of it, it becomes a hollow exercise when things are not being delivered at the end of these 5 years, or during these 5 years, where the MP shows up during the election and just campaigns, gives out T-shirts or sodas, not cash anymore because of bribery accusations, and then disappears for 4.5 years and comes back 6 months before the next election. People are increasingly disillusioned by the fact that elections are even happening, right? But what is interesting is to think about what is happening on the elite level, right? So there's this issue of what democracy is amongst the public and who we're going to vote, but also intra-elite dynamics, and we see that intra-elite dynamics show that there is some competition, especially within the party. So those who lost the primaries are jumping out and saying they'll run as independents, though there are stories about people who are saying actually now because of the issues of succession, and that once independents are in power, in parliament, that they are disrupting things, that people are now actually not running as independents as much as they were in previous elections. And given the size of the parliament, which is I think 560 members of parliament, it's quite a large parliament. It's the patronage that needs to be acquired in order to keep them all happy is quite substantial.
Okay, thank you, Matthew, for those insights on the intra-elite competition going on within the ruling party. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on what's going on there and how you could compare it to other East African cases such as Kenya or Tanzania. What's distinctive about Uganda and its political system? How does it compare with, Tanzania's tightening of civic and political space under Magufuli and Samia now? How does it compare with Kenya's more competitive but still elite-driven electoral politics? Can we see some kind of convergence in East Africa around how elections are managed?
You're making me write my dissertation all over again, or feel like I'm writing a dissertation. So I guess one of the things that we have to remember is because of the Bush Wars, the rhetoric that is used by the ruling party about what is going to happen in Uganda is quite distinct from at least the Kenyan case and Tanzania, right? So those who fought in the bush with Museveni and are in power have always gone with this language of transformation, right? Transforming the economy and bringing back all the things that were not able to be brought by Obote's regime. And so since then, it's been about economic development. Even if you see the campaign right now, I think the slogan is protecting the gains, right? There's always been something about protecting the windfall or the benefits or the things about development that they've achieved so far, and we need to maintain them. And at 81, 86, how old is he now?
Who knows?
Officially 81.
Officially 81, but I think it's actually 86.
Yeah.
It becomes a question of what happens after he's gone, right? And the opposition has always been talking about the transition to peace. But then the question is, once you have transited in a peaceful manner, does the opposition have the wherewithal and the capacity to actually maintain the government as it goes forth, right? How does this compare to the regional neighbors? I think what is interesting about both Kenya and Tanzania now, Kenya, Uganda, and now Tanzania, which is following in the footsteps, is the use of constitutional and legal means to repress, right? So it's no longer just sheer repression for the sake of it, but finding clever ways within the law, going to courts, the police, riot acts, changing the constitution of the parliament, maintaining majorities in parliament that make sure that they do what you want, and capturing the judiciary. I think that is the convergence that we're seeing, that it's about using the legal frameworks and institutions to actually create the repression that they want. The autocratic playbook, which is not just unique to sub-Saharan Africa, but now is being seen in the West and it's just spreading.
So it's not just a Ugandan thing.
It is not just a Ugandan thing. They watch each other.
They watch each other. Thank you very much, Matthew, for those thoughts. And I think Adrian will expound on that a little bit in his remarks on how the legal system is being used to, implement repression and restrict civic space. Next, I would like to hear from you, Andrea. As you might know, Uganda is a very young country with a huge youth bulge. Around 78% of Uganda's population are aged 35 and below, and more than half of Ugandans are aged less than 18 years old. So, Andrea, could you tell us, how are students and youth engaging politically in Uganda's current authoritarian elections, where the current leader is an octogenarian, as Matthew has said, and youth are anticipating and remain hopeful that change will happen inevitably sooner or later?
Yeah, well, I think I would emphasize your first point, that 80% of the population has never seen another president but President Museveni. And I think that really changed your perspective of, what democracy means, what you can do, your vote and your role in participating in society, and also the hope you have for the future. And actually also never seen a transfer of power, which I think really shifts the understanding of your role as a citizen in a, nominally democratic society, but, it's really an autocratic regime. So I think this puts youth and children in a special position because they are the substantial majority. And I think youth is seen as a potential political force. The problem is that the bigger group of youth is not a homogeneous or united group. So they are divided by class, by ethnicity, geography, and also education into subgroups of urban poor, rural communities, and also the educated elites. So in such a context, I think the bigger question is if and how youth and students can really overcome these diversities and divides and act together politically, which I think is a really, really big challenge for youth in Uganda. And then student politics in Uganda, like in many other sub-Saharan African countries, are deeply tied to national political parties. And this relationship between student politics and political parties go way back. Actually, it goes back to the late colonial era, where the student government at Makerere University, which was the first university in the country and also actually in the Central African regions, the student government there was actually founded before the political parties were founded in Uganda. So the first political party in Uganda was established in 1952, which is 10 years prior to political independence. And even before that, you had a student government that was organized and as a political organization, which is quite interesting that students organized prior to the parties. Anyways, so at Makerere, for example, but also this is kind of similar dynamic in other public universities across the country, is this strong relation between the parties and students, and specifically student leaders in the student governments. So usually the parties, they fund campaigns, and they also have quite a strong influence in who will win elections in the student governments. So you can see these relationships as transactional, exchange or resource exchange. And I think it's only a rhetorical questions of who benefits more from these relations, either if it's the students or the political parties. So student governments and students in general have become these, it's an important mobilizing actor for the political parties. And there's of course other interesting dynamics that ties the government and the university quite closely together. For example, the First Lady, Janet Museveni, she's also the Minister of Education and Sports. So
can I just ask you a follow-up question then? So with those interesting dynamics between the ruling party and Makerere University, not just Janet being the Minister of Education, but the council, Makerere University Council chairperson being her relative, and the chair of the appointments board at Makerere University being her son-in-law. Can you please then tell us a bit about how internal party dynamics within the NRM and the succession question, since apparently there are rumors in Uganda about which preferred son-in-law or son could be a successor. How are they playing out in student politics?
Well, I would say from talking to a lot of students through my PhD project, there is students I speak to that support NRM. It's quite holding back on information. You know, they don't like to discuss publicly these things. So they show like a subtle, support to Museveni and his regime, but it's not very outspoken. The students of the main oppositional party, NUP, they have a stronger pride in the party connection, and they really they present themselves as this like democratic force and like challenge of this regime over 40 years. So it's kind of hard as like a bit of a distant observer to see these debates playing out. But a recent move now in this campaigns up to the election is that Museveni actually tried to court the students to secure their support. So now there is a talk about this, what did you label it? A graduate fund. So he wants to help graduates from Makerere University or other universities with startup funds and entrepreneurial training. So there is all of these promises, to students, and I think it really shows his how important students are into his strategy to maintain control and hold on to power. Another interesting thing that was done in this election campaign was that Museveni invited student leaders across all of the campuses in Uganda to join him in the State House. Yes. This was quite public. It's also streamed online, so it's like this is something that he really wanted to promote and show. I invited all of the student leaders to come to the State House. So what he did in this meeting was really to challenge students, urging them to stop engaging in emotional or superficial politics, and then he has coined this concept of vibe politics. But what's interesting in this regard is that Museveni himself was once a student leader of, I have to find a name, it's the University Student African Revolutionary Front in Tanzania. So he knows what students can and are willing to do under repressive circumstances.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those insights, Andrea. I didn't know about this State House dinner. It will be interesting to watch that clip. Before we open up for audience Q&A, we have a recording of Adrian Juko, to whom I posed the following question. What does the pre-election environment look like in legal and human rights terms in Uganda? How are laws, courts, and security institutions being used to manage the paradoxical situation of elections that are highly unlikely to yield change, even as the succession question looms over everything? Adrian, could you please tell us, what does the pre-election environment in Uganda look like in legal and human rights terms? How are laws, courts, and security institutions being used to manage the paradoxical situation of elections that are highly unlikely to yield change, even as the question of Museveni's successor looms over everything?
Thank you so much, Monica. Before I even go into the legal and human rights aspect, I'll first talk about how it really feels in human terms. So right now I'm at Makerere University, and you can feel the tension in the air, right? From the roads, looking at other people, the anxiety on people's faces. And then there's this talk about war, like this. It's now like a joke online that, you know what, just before the war, so it's like we're moving into war. That's how it feels in human terms. The soldiers on the streets, police well armed, and everyone is looking scary, at least on the street. So one party is looking scary, the other party is looking scared. That's the human aspect of what's happening here in Kampala. But from the political and legal terms, I think I wouldn't be so wrong to describe the situation as almost ruled by law. Right now, we have all sorts of laws that are in place and all sorts of regulations that are being pushed out there by the government. And it feels like, regardless of how unconstitutional the law is, the government is going to enforce it. If you look at what has been happening right to the elections, for example, the denomination, is that even a word? Denomination. Someone who was nominated being unnominated or denominated. That has been going on. It's a new one. I don't think we've had it in the recent past. It's something that has come up new, and it shows that they can be able to use legalities, little regulations somewhere, somehow, and then they do what they have done. And of course, everyone who has been denominated is someone from the opposition, not ruling party. We had a situation where where 11 people were denominated so that one person can go through unopposed. And among those that have gone through unopposed include the Speaker of Parliament, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, and the husband to the Speaker of Parliament. So it's a situation of rule by law, where they're using the law to legalize, to do all these nasty little things using the law. And the politics has now become so openly corrupted that you can't even expect anything better from the government, from the state. And of course, even the courts of law are also becoming part of this. If you look at the recent arrest of civil society activist Sarah Birete, she's in jail, and then the magistrate wants 2 weeks to consider the bail application. That's not normal. Like a bail application, you have you have everything right there, and then you want 2 weeks. So that is the situation of rule by law. And right now, there's no recourse, because you can't run to the courts of law. They are also part of this whole game.
Thank you, Adrian, for giving us that vivid picture of what things are like in Kampala right now. I too have been following the news, and I saw that battalions of soldiers have been deployed on the streets, and the atmosphere looks very intimidating, and definitely looks like it's been, stage managed to induce fear and make it really clear what is expected and how people are expected to vote. But nonetheless, I'm curious, regardless of this militaristic show of power, if you could shed a bit more light on the bureaucratic and more legalistic aspects of repression rather than overt violence. You've mentioned that there are, that it's ruled by law. And you've also, can you just shed a bit more light on what some of these laws are, the Public Order and Management Act? And could you also tell us whether there have been any challenges to these laws? You yourself are quite actively involved in, challenging repressive and unconstitutional laws. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, thank you for that, Monica. It's interesting how the law nowadays works in Uganda. As a lawyer, I have all my faith in the law. You were told from the time you're in law school that the law works. The law can become a solution to most of these things. The reality, and most of us, for example, as teachers of law here, are wondering whether we should actually even continue teaching the actual tenets of constitutional law to our students, because what they're seeing is completely different from what we teach. It's like we're in a utopia somewhere, where we are teaching things that are not applicable to the local situation. So in terms of law, yes, we have the Public Order Management Act, as you've mentioned, which is basically about public order. You know, the police, the powers of the police were taken away at some stage by the courts of law, but who cares? That's the thing, that the court gives a decision, but who cares? No one really is there to enforce such a decision. It's like the court hasn't said anything. Look at the number of people that are in prison right now, especially people from the opposition. They have been arrested and detained, and we have had cases of torture, even alluded to by the head of the army, the president's son himself, that they're teaching them Runyankole, and they are teaching them, people have talked of fridges, people being kept in fridges. So that's creating a situation of fear, and they use any law that they want. For now, it doesn't really matter under which law they charge you. They can charge you under any law. The laws are just there for them to pick and charge you with whatever it is that they want. If you look at right now, for us in the NGO sector, we are now grappling with the issue of closure of NGOs. Today, I think we know now over about 10 that have been closed just yesterday. And today, I think the list is going to grow bigger. And this includes Sarah Viete's Center for Constitutional Governance and Chapter 4 and so many others whose permits have been withdrawn because they are involved in subversive activities under the NGO Act. Like, they can never run out of laws to use against this. And for me, the problem is the courts of law, the place we are supposed to go and which is supposed to say, hey guys, you are charging this person under a law that is, these facts don't fit the provisions of the law, or this law was declared unconstitutional. The courts don't care. They'll remind you, they keep you in jail. So right now there is this actual movement of keeping people who are critical of the government in jail until after the election. So they give you a date to come back for a bail hearing after the elections. And we all know what has been happening to Kizza Besigye, the leading, one of the contenders against Museveni before, of course. He can't do that now when he's in jail. He's been there for now, he's coming to close to a year and a half when he's in jail. So all these are situations that tell you that the bureaucracy, that the government is using all these small little laws, and they're doing this they're using this in concert with the judiciary, which is the place where people would have run to. Now, suicide organizations, which is the other area where people would have gone to, are also being closed down. They can't now operate in an environment where they've been ordered to close. Their accounts have been frozen, and practically they have been stopped from working. So that's the environment of repression that we are seeing right now in Uganda at the moment. So if you think of a transition, we all know it doesn't matter what people are going to vote for, that transition is not going to happen, at least not now, because the government is not ready for a transition, despite the fact that, you know what, Museveni is old and all that, but the transition is not happening, at least not at this moment, not this election. We all know that, although we're going to be voting tomorrow, the other day, on Thursday, happily, but we all know the outcome. It's already a foregone conclusion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. That sounds very sobering. Especially what you describe about the role of the judiciary and the legal system in perpetuating this environment of repression. So I wonder, do you have any thoughts on what does this imply for the long-term credibility of the rule of law and legal institutions in Uganda?
I really don't know how we are going to recover, all of us, the whole country really, in almost all aspects, not even just the law, but more especially lawyers. And I think this must be one of the issues at the forefront of what the Law Society, Uganda Law Society membership is thinking. Because if you know the history of Uganda Law Society and the president who is currently in exile and who's being fought left, right, and center, just yesterday, there was a confirmation that his hearing can go on. The private position case against him should go on. So the lawyers themselves right now, the leadership is in disarray in very many ways. The leadership decided that we are now going to be, the Uganda Society is going to have is going to support the opposition as against the current government, because the government is not living up to the rule of law. And then you had some of the elder lawyers coming up and saying, oh no, this can't happen, you cannot be partisan at this moment. So for us as lawyers, I think it's a tough situation. Like, how do you remain neutral in such an environment an environment of repression, an environment where there's no rule of law to speak about. And this is going to determine again what happens after the election. What does this actually mean if the courts of law cannot be guarantors of justice? If Parliament, which is supposed to pass law, can't pass law that is actually that's actually sensible, I'll put it that way, that is actually sensible, that is actually legal. What does this mean for the legal system? And again, for us as law teachers, what does this mean for the people we are teaching, the students we are teaching? That this is how the law works, this is how constitutionalism works. So for me, I'm really quite worried about the future, what this means, and which kind of precedent we are setting as a country, both in terms of legal terms, but also in terms of political terms, but also in terms of we used to have people we used to look up to when we were growing up, lawyers and leaders and political leaders. I don't really think we still have them anymore. Like we are going to look at and be like, yes, that person is credible. I want to be such kind of lawyer when I grow up, or this kind of Speaker of Parliament when I grow up, because that credibility is largely gone. So for me, regardless of what happens to Museveni eventually, whether he lives or he doesn't, eventually you have to live. But what does this mean for us as a country, for us as a profession, as lawyers, but for the country as a country? What does this actually mean when every institution has been brought to its knees, when there's no free and fair elections, when people cannot speak out, when NGOs have been buried? And as you know right now, you can't also run anywhere. We have anywhere else. We've seen what's happening with the US and the end of multilateralism practically all over the world. And no one is saying anything about other countries. So we are practically on our own at this moment. And that's the future, the way I see it in the short run.
Thank you for your patience. Turned out to be quite a long recording. I think Adrian and I maybe got a little bit carried away with the lawyers and legal discussion thing. But I'd like to open the floor now for any questions or comments you might have. Yeah, address them to Andrea and Matthew and maybe anyone else, because Adrian won't be able to answer. Yeah.
And you, Monica.
Yeah.
And me, maybe.
Thanks, Mon.
Please proceed.
I was just in Kenya in November observing the by-elections there, and one thing I was very impressed by civil society is how different organizations, election observers and media kind of worked strategically together, doing things so that the government didn't really know who to punish for it, who to get for it. And it was very interesting to hear how they can use these sorts of strategies to still keep going. And I met Sarah Beti, as he mentioned, that's in prison right now, just in September. So I'm kind of, I think my question is there still space and room for different organizations to work together, and is there still this kind of sense of community, NGO community in Uganda, or is the pressure too high for this to really thrive there as well?
I mean, so you start.
Okay, I can start. Well, I think one of the strategic moves that Museveni makes in Uganda is that he ruled by creating uncertainty. And he pushed back against people and opposition in a selective manner. And this causes, I think, students or any other opposition or NGOs you have to be strategic, you know, when you want to mobilize. So I think this concept of, you know, working together across different units and organizations and networks is really good, and I think they do that on the ground. Because you have to be able to socially maneuver to kind of bypass these more informal restrictions. So I think it happens, but it's quite difficult to, you know, see it in bright light because it has to kind of go a bit underground. But I think that's something Ugandans are really good at, and I think that's some of the strength of civil society and students as well.
Matthew, thoughts?
I think I agree completely with Andrea, but there's also this issue of domain context, right? So with the Anti-Homosexuality Bill of 2023 and what that has entailed for civil society organizations that deal with queer rights in Uganda, that means that cooperation across domains has become much more difficult, right? So in a place where you'd think that there would be some intersectionality, right? Poverty, gender, queer identities, that there'd be cooperation, now that cooperation is actually seen as potentially, not potentially, that cooperation is seen as illegal, right? So then LGBT groups are basically completely sidelined, and those that are working on gender do not want to even anything to do with those that deal with queer rights, because doing that will see you shut down, right? There's the question of infiltration as well, right? So are you aligned with the government, or are you not aligned with the government? Are people going to report what you're doing because you're getting funding from foreign governments, and is that going to be seen as a threat to national security? The authoritarian playbook in infiltrating civil society spaces, because this is the check on them, is quite sophisticated. And in Kenya, what they've been able to do, as you just said, is just find ways to diffuse leadership in these organizations and in these movements, so then that way when it comes time to say we're going to pick up somebody, there is nobody to pick up. So instead they pick up everybody, right? Which causes its own sort of chaos, right? So it's the dynamic is quite complicated, I would say.
Yeah, I think I could add that from my knowledge and understanding of the Ugandan NGO space also historically, is that Uganda is just neoliberalized in a slightly different way from Kenya. And I think from what you both said, there's such a heavy neoliberal under and overtone, and everything ends up being about the economy. And Uganda has a much more NGO-preneur kind of context, where historically a lot of NGOs have been formed as a way for people to earn a living. That's not untrue as well. Even though they do have a positive impact, it's also true that NGOs in Uganda are, some kind of entrepreneurship. And I think with the historical competition for funding, for donor funding and so on, it has not stifled cooperation and collaboration entirely, but I think that it's much more patchy and uneven than it is in neighboring Kenya, because also of this historical legacy of competition for donor funding. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
While we're waiting for a question, I will add that I think at some point there were over 1,000 NGOs that are dealing just with HIV/AIDS.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
so that shows you for the scale of NGOization
Yes.
that exists.
Exactly. And probably nationally there are hundreds of thousands of NGOs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah?
Thank you very much for this. Can you say something about the risk of election-related violence? I mean, we always see the main opposition leader in his flak jacket at campaign events, so can you perhaps say something about that? Thank you.
Yeah, any thoughts? We'll take it.
Well, I think the way I've been following the news, I think that the fear of violence has escalated. When you see Bobby Wine go on stage in his campaigns, he's wear helmets and vests. He appear on stage maybe 20 seconds and then he's off. And I think we didn't see this to the same extent in the previous election. Of course, that was under a bit of different circumstances because of the pandemic, which was a really, really good tool to use from Museveni to restrict opposition. And my scare is also that the dynamics from the Tanzanian election and the aftermath and the violence we saw there can also have an impact on what we will see in the next couple of days in Uganda.
Thank you, Andrea. Matthew, any thoughts?
I think, so while we're doing fieldwork in December, the one thing that I think a lot of the respondents said is at least it is not 2021, right? Because I think that was a really traumatic experience for Uganda, and this I think explains the fear that Adrian is explaining in his video, right? That those who look scared and then those who are scaring, so to speak. In the current one, I think over 460 arrests have happened of opposition members. There is a lot of intimidation, and what's interesting is that the closer we get to the election, the intimidation has increased. As of, I think, last week or sometime this week, the NUP party used to have flags up, the national flag, right? But then those have all been torn down in every NUP office, right? Because the national flag should not be used for campaign activities, right? As the opposition were making its way through the country in the beginning, they had a lot of leeway because the regime thought they will not have a lot of attendance. But they could see each time the opposition showed up, attendance was really high. So what has happened after this? Those are closed down, or heavy police presence to prevent that the campaigning happens. There was a lot of violence during the movement's own primaries, because people were using bribes. People felt they were denominated or unprimaried out of their seats. So violence happened there. So election violence has been steadily increasing, and now with the internet shut down yesterday, today it's still shut down, and tomorrow I think it will still be shut down. We can only speculate about what's going to happen in these 2 days where the news is not coming out. Hopefully VPNs are available and people can get the news out. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's an open question, and one that every Ugandan is pondering. Will there be violence? Will we break out into another civil war? I don't really study Uganda, but from my conversations with friends and relatives, I think that Ugandans live with a lot of cognitive dissonance, because everyone's afraid, but they haven't done anything about it. Here is what they would really, really do if they were really, really afraid, is that there would be an exodus from the city, a massive one, and everyone would head to the rural areas where they think they'd be safer. But from my conversations with friends and relatives, no such exodus has occurred. A lot of the people who live in the city have stayed in the city, and there are literally soldiers on every corner, which strikes fear, but also paradoxically induces a sense of safety, that there will not be violence. So it's just that paradox, I think, that people are living with and waiting to see whether there will be what people see as foolhardy people that will dare to protest and ignite violence when there are literally soldiers on every corner. It's just a question of waiting and seeing. Yeah, I don't know whether anyone else has any questions or contributions. We still have a bit of time. But if not, I guess we can have closing thoughts from our speakers. We'll start with you, Andrea. Any final thoughts on what we should be watching for as Uganda heads into the final election tomorrow? Votes will soon start being tallied, results announced. What should we be looking for as things start to happen?
Yeah, no, I think in relation to student politics and their role in these election campaigns, and in general this more historic relationship with political parties, I think still students are more preoccupied with support to their political or their political parties. So you see a fragmentation within student governments, and I think also inviting the whole student leadership to the State House, it's part of creating this divisions, and making those divisions deeper. And what we saw in the aftermath of that invitation to the State House was that NUP actually suspended their student leaders, and for some time being they're not even allowed to represent the party. So even within the opposition is also causing divisions. And I think my overarching point is that this division is not by default. It's very strategic, and it's a part of dividing and rule, because then you make the opposition, including students and youth, too weak to really constitute an alternative to Museveni's regime. So as long as those divisions keep growing, the kind of the democratic potential of youth is quite limited, I think.
Thank you. That's a really interesting insight on the divide and rule strategy that the ruling party is deploying in subtle yet effective ways. Thanks, Andrea. And how about you, Matthew? Any concluding thoughts?
So I guess the thoughts about what to watch out for. I would say I think the things that I'll be watching out for is the turnout rate, right? So not just by how much the movement wins, but who turns out to vote at a what rate, right? Especially the youth. Are they going to be completely disengaged and not show up, or will they actually turn out and vote the opposition? And that's the first. The second is women's representation, where that goes up, especially in the open seats. So Uganda does have quotas, but then women who are running in these open seats report experiencing high levels of harassment and violence, especially online. So what happens to them in this election? Will the number of women in parliament go up, or will it stay the same? And who's going to get rewarded and who's not going to get rewarded post-election, right? So what the movement and Museveni are really good at is using patronage and state positions to reward people who've delivered, and those who've demonstrated that they have gained a substantial amount of power or domain are usually cut at their feet. So watching for these people, so we saw this in the primaries, ministers lost their primary seats, right? Which most people would think it's a minister, they would not do that, but they did. So now in this election, who's getting rewarded afterwards is something to watch out for, because that tells you about the dynamics of the succession, which happened, especially given that I think Muhoozi, his son, his faction of the party have won 60% of the seats. So a lot of people who are in Muhoozi's pocket are the ones who are going to get seats, and will that really indicate what the succession will be post-Museveni.
Interesting. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing those thoughts on the spoils of the patronage system and how they're going to be distributed. I also asked Adrian. Just another clip.
Yeah. Thanks, Monica. One, of course, is that we don't go into war. That's the one thing that puts an end to everything, right? Right now we are talking of limited democracy, limited rule of law, limited good governance, blah, blah. But if it comes to outright war, people are fighting and violence on the streets and people are being killed, then all these things actually cease to matter. Because in that situation, then the rule of law is almost suspended. So it's just a wish that we don't really go into outright violence, because the way that projection seems to suggest, that's where we are headed. I don't think the government is going to cave in. I don't think the opposition also, at least the young people who are on the street demanding for change, who would also relent at this stage. So we have a stage that is almost set for violence, set for violence. People are tired after 40 years of this government, but this government seems to be going nowhere. They're not really thinking about going anywhere. So for me, my final thoughts are really on whether we're going to have peace, and whether what we're talking about here really would make any sense if actual violence and war erupts in this country. So we are at that kind of brink. Today, we've been thinking about our organizations, our offices, and how to leave them as we go into this break. What does it mean? If you leave your office today, are you going to find it the same way when you come back on Monday? Are we coming back on Monday? For me, it's an actual existential question at the moment. We have a country to return to when the elections come to an end. So that's how bad things have become. So beyond rule of law and good governance and institutions that are no longer that are not purely biased, it's also worrying if we are going to have a country to come back to a place where we can sit down and have these conversations and continue that conversation. That's how bad it gets.
Yeah, and I think that's a good note on which to end our conversation, that the elections do pose an existential question. For many Ugandans, it's really about that, and I think that ends up being what decides whether people decide to protest or not, and whether there will be violence or not. Of course, existential will mean different things to different people. Young people might feel like they have nothing to lose and they should protest anyway. Older people might feel like, we've seen what war is like before, would rather stay quiet and silent. So since the youth are more, they are more in numbers and they are the majority, I think we just have to wait and see how things play out. But thank you all for joining us, being bravely and braving the rain. And I hope that you found the discussion interesting and useful. Thank you.